Okay, this is manufacturing part 2. We're going to talk about the processes that they make when they're doing manufacturing. This is a list of them. You have some handouts, and what you should do is glue in each picture that goes with each kind, and then be sure to take notes with the pictures as well. The first one is casting and foundry processes. And when we're doing casting is when we take in one step, we go from the raw material all the way to the shape we really wanted. So first we create some kind of mold, and you can see it in this process here. So we want to have this little red shape made out of metal. So we take this shape and put it in a mold. And when we take the little red shape out, we're left with a little impression there. And you can have two kind of molds. This one it's kind of showing here is like a single-use mold. Often that's out of sand, where they just leave the impression in the sand. Or it could be multi-use molds made out of some other material that we can form to fit around the desired shape. The material that we're going to pour into the mold is then heated up to a specific temperature so that the material becomes a liquid. If we're talking about metal, that's going to be a much higher temperature than if we're talking about, say, a plastic. And then we pour it into the empty hollow space that was left in the mold. Then we remove the casting, this is called a casting, or the mold, and we pull this off, and what we're left with is the shape inside. We then take this shape that's left, these are examples, and they have to be cleaned up. Depending on what kind of mold we used and what kind of material we used, the finish that's on there is somewhere between this relatively smooth one up to sometimes a very rough surface that we then have to grind down and smooth up. Many engine parts are made this way, cast iron is made this way, etc., along with plastics. And in these cases, any excess material that has to be scraped off or ground off can then be recycled back into the melted part we're going to pour into another mold. Okay, our second kind is forming and metalworking. And these utilize materials that we've already cast. So we've already cast something in the previous step, and now we're going to modify the shape of these. The shape, the size, the physical properties. And there's two different kinds, cold and hot. The first one is rolling, and it's like, this is what rolling does. We basically start with a thicker material on this side, and then we run it through rollers, and it ends up thinning it out. That's rolling. Forging is where we take a shape, like this little square brick looking thing, and we put it inside this mold, and then we apply a lot of force. And when we apply this huge force to it, it basically squishes the metal out into the shape we now really wanted. This is the same kind of thing that happens with old-fashioned blacksmiths, where they heat up the metal and then hit it with a hammer to get it in the shape they want. That's forging. Extrusion is where, like, I have a material over, this is the material, and they take what's called a ram and they push the material through a small opening here called the die. And what you end up with on this side is a uniform size that's much smaller. The important thing to realize with extrusion is that you're pushing the material through. It's different than drawing, because drawing is basically exactly the opposite. Here we have some kind of mechanism on this side that grabs a hold of the end of our material and then it pulls it out. We can get the same kind of rod here or here, but here the mechanism is pulling it, here it's pushing it. And there's different applications for both of them. In both of these, we could have wire shapes, rod shapes, or tube shapes in both of these. The difference here is this one gets pushed through and this one gets pulled out. And finally, we have cold forming and forging. So this is just a process. It's similar to the one we talked about earlier with forging, but here we're starting with cool metals or cool materials, and we're doing the process with it when it's cold. Again, you'll notice this, they're taking a wire, they take this little piece of wire, they put it into the die, they squish it with the die so that it comes out the shape of, starting to get this screw shape. They put it into this little thing that makes the point on the end, and then they crush it with this little part here that creates the little threads on the screw. This happens to be done when it's cold versus when it's hot.